Well, I was lucky when I was a kid. In the fourth grade, I took up the trumpet, and my music teacher called me into his house one day. I was walking by, and he said, "I want you to hear something." And he put on Louis Armstrong's West End Blues, which had a wonderful trumpet cadenza. And just really, I knew that was what I wanted to do. So that got me interested in jazz. Before that, my mother was a musician, but she had gotten me interested in the classical world. And so this was my first opportunity to hear jazz. And I right away, I got an after-school job, and all of my pennies went into buying records. And some of the first records I bought, of course, were Duke Ellington. I was very fond of Johnny Hodges' sound and the quality of the Ellington band. It just swung so hard. And so many years later, I went to hear Duke whenever I could, but that was kind of like the stars, you know. And I was working with Jerry Mulligan's quartet, and we were on a program at there was an outdoor concert hall there up near Columbia University, and we were opposite Duke Ellington's band. And Duke came over to Jerry and said, "Look, I got something to do tonight, so would you mind if I go on first?" Okay, so the band gets up on the stand, and there's no bass player. Jimmy Woody was supposed to be the bass player, but he overslept or something. So Duke looks at his watch and he looks at the sky. He's afraid it's going to rain, and then he comes over and takes me by the sleeve and says, "Come with me." And he puts me down on the bandstand with the rest of the band. I start to take out the book, and Britt Woodman behind me says, "Don't do that, that's all been changed." And so I said, "What should I do?" He said, "Just hang around in B flat and we'll tell you when to change." So Duke is talking to the audience, and I'm hanging around in B flat, riffing with the band, and I'm having a wonderful time. And Duke has sense enough to call tunes that are so far back in his repertoire that they were big hits that I would probably know. And I knew all the tunes he called until he got to a ballad which he had just written, and he knew I didn't know it, so he's at the piano right beside me. And we start to play, he tells me the key, and then he just points at my note on the keyboard, and I play it, and he sees that I'm getting the clue that way, so he leads me through the entire ballad arrangement. Johnny Hodges is playing the melody, and I didn't miss a note because he just before I needed one, he would point to it on the keyboard. And then, it must have been 2 or 3 months after that, I was down in French Lick, Indiana at a jazz festival, and Duke's band was there. And I was waiting to get in the elevator, and the door opened, and he walked out, and he said, "Oh, Mr. Crow," he said, "I never had the opportunity to properly remunerate you for your excellent services at that concert." And I said, "Duke, that was the thrill of my life. Please be my guest." And he bowed and went on into the dining room. So, because I love Duke so much, I always like to start with a Duke Ellington tune. And this one is called In a Mellow Tone. was in the Army, I met a cornet player that knew all of the good old tunes, and he taught me the repertoire of everything from Louis Armstrong up to about Muggsy Spaniel. And I was playing the baritone horn then. That was my high school instrument. And everybody thought that was not a jazz instrument, so they encouraged me to get a valve trombone, which fingered the same way, but sounded more like a jazz horn. So I got one, and that was what I came to New York playing, a valve trombone. I studied a little with Lenny Tristano on that horn. And then I got a summer job up in Tupper Lake, New York, very close to the Canadian border. And the guy wouldn't hire a bass player for some reason. He had drums, piano, tenor, and trumpet. And I went up, I was supposed to just be visiting for the weekend, but the drummer, who was the guy that talked me into coming to New York in the first place, had me sit in on trombone, and he went to the boss and he said, sounds good with the extra horn, doesn't it? And he said, yeah, it does. He said, well, you know, he's very much in demand in New York, but he's got a little spot on his lung and he needs to stay in the mountains for a while, so maybe you could get him, you know. So I got hired for, I think it was $15 or $20 a week in room and board, something like that. And the third night that I was on the job, I came in and there was a bass on the stand. And I said, hey, the boss finally break down and let you hire a bass player? And he said, no, I found this kid that's got a bass he only uses during the school year, so I rented it from him for the summer, and when you're not playing the trombone, you gotta try to play the bass. So they didn't know how to tell me how to play. I knew how to tune it, I knew what the notes were, but I knew what the bass line sounded like on the records that I'd been collecting, and I just had to find out where the notes were on the instrument. I didn't know there was a fingering system, but by the end of the summer, I'd found where the notes were enough that I could offer myself as a bass player. And I came back to New York and would pick up jobs like a Saturday night club date, but I didn't own a bass. So there was a guy on 6th Avenue that would rent me a bass for $5 for the weekend, and maybe I'd have to rent a tux for another $5 for the weekend. And the jobs paid $15 or $20. And I could live on that. It was, you know, New York was cheap in those days. We had the automat, and we had a very inexpensive furnished rooms, $8 a week with cockroaches. Well, I came to New York in 1950, in January 1950. And I had heard about 52nd Street being the mecca of jazz, but by the time I got here in 1950, all of those clubs had closed. The war was over and business was down, and they'd all become either Chinese restaurants or strip clubs. But Birdland had just opened, and so I went there every night. It was like going to school, because Bird was playing there with his band. And so he had Red Rodney and Bud Powell and Roy Haynes and Tommy Potter in his band. And then the house band that played opposite them was all guys that had recorded with Bird. So they had Sonny Stitt and Miles Davis and J.J. Johnson and Curly Russell and Max Roach and Al Hay. So I just went down there every night. I didn't know where else to go, but that was 75 cents. I could get in there and stay all night. And it was like going to school, you know. So maybe we should play a tune from that period.
Sure.
Well, which one of Bird's tunes would you like?
Any of those are fine. I mean, those, what is it, like Birdland, like confirmation, or apology?
Sure.
With the confirmation?
Sure. Parker was something special. You hear on his records how wonderfully he played, but in person, he was not limited to the length of a record. The records were like 2.5, 3 minutes, something like that. When he played at Birdland and on concerts, he would play a tune like that for maybe 10 minutes, you know, and just never repeat himself, you know. He came up with such interesting inventions. Al Cohen said it best. He said, people think that it was just that Bird was better than everybody else, but he said it was that there was Bird and then there was everybody else. so it was lovely to be around while he was still with us. Well, when I was in the Army, I was down in Baltimore, between Baltimore and Washington, Fort Meade, Maryland, and we found that about 9 o'clock at night we could get radio programs from Chicago. For some reason, the atmosphere would change and you could get distant radio. And Dave Garroway had a radio show, and he was in love with Sarah Vaughan, so he played a lot of her records. And I think we'll play one of hers. Don't Blame Me?
Sure. That's fine. Yeah.
$75, and I had $5. So I gave him the $5 and said, "Would you hold that for me until I get some more money?" "Sure, why not?" So I went out on the road as a singing drummer with Mike Riley and his musical maniacs. Mike was an old clown and trombone player, and he was one of the writers of a tune called "The Music Goes Round and Round," which was the biggest hit in 1930 because everybody had their radios on New Year's Eve to dance, and they played this tune over and over again. So I managed to save up enough money while working on the road with Mike in towns like Monessen, Pennsylvania, and Troy, New York, and until I finally had enough money to buy my bass and gave up the comedy world and went to playing serious jazz. Well, I was working with Teddy Charles's trio. He was a vibraphone player. We rehearsed every day and worked about once a month, something like that. But he taught me all my bebop tunes, and we had a wonderful guitar player from Chicago named Don Roberts. I don't know whatever became of him. He left Teddy to go for a short job with Benny Goodman, and then I never heard from him again. But Jimmy Rainey had been playing with Stan Getz in those days, but Stan had gone to the coast for the summer, and so Jimmy was available, and Teddy hired him. Well, Jimmy was just a wonderful guitar player, and he taught me all of those good bebop tunes and how to the right chords for standards and all that. And then when Stan Getz came back from the West Coast, he called Jimmy and said, "I got a week in Boston, and Roy Haynes is living up there, so he's going to play drums. So get a bass player and come on up." So that Jimmy got me on the job. And I thought it was just going to be 1 week, but it turned into 6 months, I guess, that I worked with Stan and got to record a little bit. So they got my name around, and I started working more. And my first really good job was with Marion McPartland at the Hickory House. Joe Morello was the drummer. And I stayed there for a couple of years. It was a really nice job to play every night and lots of hanging out. Even Duke Ellington came in there because his publicity man had worked out a deal with the Hickory House that they could eat for nothing there if Joe would get the Hickory House mentioned in Walter Winchell's column frequently. So we saw a lot of Duke. They were in there having steaks a lot, and once in a while Marion would coax him into coming and playing with us. That was always very nice. So let me see. The tune that I used to play with Marion that was very popular because Tommy Dorsey played it a lot. I'm getting sentimental over you. All right. All right. No, it's okay.
You got a boss.
Sure, yeah. Any of them. Is that right?
Yeah. I was good friends with Jim Hall, and he went to a tour of South America one year, and he came back with records that I had never heard before, Bossa Nova, and they were by João Gilberto, and I fell in love with all of those tunes, and so we're going to play one, Dave. Well, I used to work down at the Half Note a lot. It was a club down on Spring Street. And the father, Frank Cantorino, had a little lunch counter in there during the war. And when his two sons, Mike and Sonny, came back out of the service, they were interested in jazz, and they talked him into making his little place, a jazz club. And they found that there was a vacant store next to this little place he had on the corner. So they tore down a wall and built a bar with the bandstand in the middle of it. And they were all ready to go. And the guys from the city came by and said, "What, did you get a permit to do this?" And I said, "No." They said, "Well, you can't do that." And they had to put the wall back and then go get a permit and then tear it down again and make the bandstand. But it became a spot that a lot of jazz fans liked because you could sit at the bar and the band was right there in front of you. The most popular band there was Al Cohn and Zoot Sims. I played with them several times when the regular bass player was busy doing something else. And it was nice to get to know Zoot. He was a very funny guy. He drank a lot, but he could hold it. And he would always, somebody said, "Zoot, how can you play so well when you're drunk?" And he says, "I practice when I'm drunk." He came into Jim and Andy's bar one day. Usually he wore a baseball cap and a sports jacket and corduroys. But here he had a blue suit on with a red tie and a white shirt. And everybody said, "Hey, Zoot, you're all dressed up. What's the occasion?" He says, "I don't know, I woke up this way." When we were playing together, when we were both with Jerry Mulligan's sextet, we were over in Paris. And Zoot was very popular with the local musicians, so they were pouring lots of wine and stuff down him, and he never refused to drink. So by the time we got through with the 4 shows at the Olympia Theater and then went out to a nightclub where they were having a jam session, Zoot was pretty wasted, but he could still swing. He couldn't articulate much, but he could still swing. He turned around to me afterwards and he says, "You know, you can have a lot of fun with these musical instruments." So I miss him a great deal. He was a wonderful pal. So let's see. leads in. All those senators, the love bless the room, made my life very happy.
Bill, we have to rehearse tomorrow. We have to rehearse tomorrow.
Well, I think we're going to take a little break, and we'll be back in a few minutes. Thanks for listening.
Hey, Bill. I know the course you playing and talking, you're like doing the whole thing here. Nice playing with you.
Yes,
Always
you too. You too.